Welcome to Zoom. Please press pound, then enter your meeting ID, followed by the pound sign again.
Nine, 2, 5, 0, 4, 6, 0, 4.
Please enter the meeting passcode, followed by the pound sign. If you are the meeting host, please enter your host key followed by pound. You are in the meeting now.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along. It's great to have you all here, including all the participants online. Today, I'm honoured to moderate a panel of a wide range of experts on subnational conflicts in middle-income countries. My name is Paddy Barron. I'm the Global Lead for Social Cohesion and Resilience in the social sustainability and inclusion global practice, which is quite a mouthload. Essentially, I'm the FCB guy in the social development team at the bank. I've spent much of my career working on subnational conflicts in middle-income countries, including in Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. Why are we doing this session today? Well, I think historically it's been commonly assumed that fragility, conflict, and violence is a low-income country problem. In fact, pretty much the first conflict unit at the World Bank was called LICUS, the Low-Income Countries Under Stress Group. Now, obviously, there's assumptions there that it's low-income countries are the ones that face these types of problems. And I think a lot of the intellectual academic apparatus at that time, by the likes of Paul Collier, who was at the bank, for example, was pointing to this vicious circle of conflict, fragility, and underdevelopment that countries and people would get stuck in. But I think in more recent years, there has been a growing awareness that these issues are not confined to low-income countries. The fact of places like Syria and many other predominant countries in the world that we would think should be robust to these issues but are not. And so at the bank, we commissioned a study a few years ago on fragility, conflict, and violence in middle-income countries. Google it, you'll find it. It's a great read. I'm the main author, so I have to say that. And one of the things we did was to try and quantify this. So we looked at the number of deaths from political violence. This is using Uppsala data. And we found that in the second decade of this century, there have been over 500,000 people killed in middle-income countries compared to 370,000 in low-income countries. We found that of the 15 countries with the highest per capita death rates, 8 were middle-income countries, and that this issue didn't only relate to political conflict, but also to homicides and interpersonal violence, that 13 out of the 15 countries with the highest homicide rates in the world were middle-income countries as well. And in fact, the homicide rates in some of these middle-income countries in Latin America and the Caribbean were higher than the deaths per capita from conflict in Afghanistan at the peak of the conflict. And then, of course, since we did that report, we have Ukraine. And, you know, I don't need to say a lot about the devastation that's taken place there. What the study found was that conflict and violence continue as countries transition up the income scale. It's only, at least statistically in terms of risk, once countries get to high income status that they tend to be less vulnerable to these things. We also found that there are many challenges for development actors, such as the World Bank, but others as well, of working on FCV in these countries. For one, there's not as much aid around normally, and that which there is, at least from organisations like the bank, is not always in grant or concessional form. And so this disincentivises governments sometimes from deciding to work together on what can be very difficult political issues. Indeed, governments are often wary of ceding room to international agencies and international bodies to work on what they deem as being their own sovereign issues as well. And often one of the most predominant types of conflict in these places is subnational conflict. These conflicts are often devastating locally, but only affect very small proportions of the population in the country, meaning that they don't always become national issues. So we have a great panel here to grapple with these issues. I would thank the Malcolm H. Kerr Centre for Carnegie Studies Middle East and the Asia Foundation for sponsoring this panel, and for FCDO for providing funding for much of the research that's going to be presented today. We're going to structure the panel today as a series of dialogues. First, we have Nathan Shea with Azima Chima discussing the case of Pakistan. I won't give their full bios. If you go onto the app, you can download them. But Nathan is the Assistant Director of Conflict and Fragility at the Asia Foundation, who manages the cross-border conflict research project ACCEPT, looking at borderland issues. And Azima is a founding director of Verso Consulting, where she leads their portfolio on conflict, fragility, and violence. We'll then turn to the Middle East including Lebanon and Iraq, in a conversation between Mohammed Haig Ali and Ibrahim Nemeh. Mohammed is the Deputy Director of Research at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Centre, while Ibrahim is a member of the Lebanese Parliament. And then finally, I'll be in conversation with Assistant Secretary Anne Witkowski. Anne was sworn in as Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations in the US government in January 2022, and she has a long history working with think tanks and in government on these issues. And Anne's going to talk about the US Global Fragility Act and lessons for addressing FCV in middle-income countries. Just before I hand over to the panel, I have some very important announcements. First of all, I've been asked to say that there will be Senegalese food for sale in the World Bank cafeteria by a renowned Senegalese chef who's visiting this week. And for those who don't want to spend money, there will be complimentary snacks in the lunch area. So let me hand over to Nathan and Azima for the first part of today's session. Thank you.
Thanks, Paddy. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. It's a pleasure to be here in DC and to kick off this panel today. For the Asia Foundation, as an international NGO coming up on our 70th anniversary, we remain optimistic about the economic growth, development, and other opportunities that are taking place in Asia. And there's been good progress in the area of peace in recent years. In the last 20 years, there have been a number of important success stories for the region. Aceh in Indonesia has remained relatively stable since the peace process in 2005. Nepal has navigated an inclusive political transition. And the Bangsamoro in the Philippines is making real progress under its enhanced regional autonomy, just to name a few examples. But despite this, there are also areas for concern where we see continued instability and violence in parts of Asia. The World Bank's report on fragile conflict and violence in middle-income countries highlights the Philippines and southern Thailand as two examples. But in the last year, we've also seen ongoing militancy in Pakistan, outbreaks in intercommunal violence in northeast India, and of course, the ongoing civil war in Myanmar. Many of these are not new, and some of these trends were articulated by the Asia Foundation over 10 years ago in our report, The Contested Corners of Asia, and the follow-up Contested Areas in Myanmar, both reports which were sponsored and supported by the World Bank. A common trend among these conflicts is the persistence of violence adjacent to, alongside, and across international borders. And in particular, we see correlative trends around how conflicts seep across border lines and how they're interconnected through political, economic, and social ties. And so since 2018, the Asia Foundation has led the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Programme, along with our good friends at Chemonics and with support from the UK government. Commonly referred to as by the acronym of ACCEPT, the programme seeks to better understand conflict-affected borderlands, how conflicts connect across borders, and the factors that shape violent and peaceful behaviour. The programme includes the ACCEPT Local Research Network, which engages experts on the ground to build data, evidence analysis that reflects the local experiences of fragility and conflict, and seeks to inform development and policy-making practice. And along with my organization's focus on Asia, our partnerships with the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Centre and the Rift Valley Institute, who unfortunately can't be here today, have allowed us to research dynamics in conflict areas including Asia, but also from across the Levant, Yemen, North Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, and the Horn of Africa. And while each conflict is, of course, different, not only through the conflict factors, but also their intensity, there are commonalities that reveal trends about how conflict affects, how countries are affected by conflict and seek to manage conflicts across their border regions. So while I won't attempt to summarize 7 years of research, data, and findings in the next 3 minutes, I will highlight 3 trends, especially as relates to the challenges middle-income countries face regarding fragility, conflict, and violence. And I'll start off by saying there still can be a lazy tendency to view conflict-affected border areas as backwards, frontier regions of severe violence, unlawfulness, and criminality, a modern-day Wild West. And while I won't unpack some of the racial or other discriminatory undertones that can drive such views, it's also quite a simplistic characterization and simply not true in a vast number of instances. Border areas are sites of significant state presence, quite often, either directly or through proxy actors, where there are efforts to enforce trade and migration policies, collect tariffs, and otherwise secure the territory of the state. And at the same time, there are communities that have been living in those areas for generations, which can have their own local forms of governance and are integrated into the borderland social and political order. Similarly, local economic activity, both in legal and sometimes illicit ways, can actually provide a powerful stabilizing effect on local conflict environments. Quite simply, when there's less violence, there's more opportunities to work and to earn a living and make money. And this is not to say that indigenous border practices or economies are inherently peaceful, particularly when it comes to systemic or structural violence, but simply to say that there are stabilizing forces even if the economic or governance practices fall outside of those areas that are state-sanctioned. So that's the first point just on borderland governance. I want to turn to a second point quickly on, which is to say that conflict-affected border areas are also highly connected domestically and transnationally. An obvious example is the ways in which primarily state-sanctioned but also illicit trade flows through borders, integrating them into wider markets in the global economy. But also we see the movement of people around and across borders, either as migrants, refugees, or even through trafficked individuals, and the role of diaspora networks, both as sources of remittances or humanitarian aid, or even in supporting armed activity, which all can play an important and complex role. And though no longer a new phenomena, increasingly the role of the internet in allowing for ideological and identity-based international connections and for fueling online criminal activity and networks is playing an important role. Altogether, the transnational interconnectivity of these conflicts in border areas means that they can prove difficult to address through state-based security and political institutions and have unpredictable impacts on internal and regional security. My final point is that sustained national economic growth may not lead to the resolution of conflict, and in some instances can exacerbate and inflame tensions, picking up what Paddy was saying earlier. Quite often, subnational conflict areas are some of the most persistently impoverished regions and are left out from the larger development gains experienced by growing middle-income countries, driving greater inequality. Border areas can be the site of exploitative and extractive economic activities, such as the pilfering of natural resources to drive a country's development with little flowing back to local communities. And as states' political and security apparatuses strengthen, especially in middle-income countries, state building and development can often be a coercive exercise through the implementation of top-down political reforms and the expansion of security infrastructure that can displace local governance practices or literally displace and divide local communities. So while broadly ineffective at addressing conflict drivers or being something that's a practice that's sustainable long-term, coercive state-building activities can reinforce old or create new forms of grievances, embedding conflict drivers for generations. And worryingly, there are signs globally of states increasingly turning to and deploying punitive conflict management practices and a retreat of efforts towards and support for liberal peace-building ideals that would emphasize inclusive development and participatory and representative governance. So away from that broad overview of some of the key trends, what does this actually look like in practice? Well, allow me to bring in my colleague Azima, a member of our local research network, to discuss how some of these dynamics are playing on the ground. And Azima, you've been researching the Afghanistan-Pakistan border as part of ACCEPT for the past 6 years. And while in the 2.5 years since the fall of the Islamic Republic, we've seen a significant reduction of active conflict in Afghanistan, we're witnessing the opposite trend in Pakistan with increased militant activity, particularly in the restive regions along the border. In the chapter that you wrote for the ACCEPT report, Border Towns, Markets and Conflict, you refer to the border region as a system and talk about a phenomenon of state capture versus state collapse. And I was hoping that you could explain what you mean by that, and how do you see the conflict dynamics playing out currently?
Thanks, Nathan. And Joyce, thanks for having us here, and to the FCDO for facilitating this process over the number of years. I think overall, the point that Paddy raised about that sort of a disconnect where you think that in lower income countries, you would see a high levels of violence, but they're actually coming out of that extreme contest that's happening in middle income countries. I think Pakistan and Afghanistan are an excellent sort of case study of that phenomena. And particularly what we've seen in Pakistan as we set out to research this border, first of all, we needed to develop some kind of a framework that we thought would stand the test of time. And so we wanted to look at it not just as a line, because it matters when studying border systems, how you conceptualize a border in itself. We were looking at the region, which again understood to be a periphery and is treated very differently by, by capitals around the world, whereas borders are often the center of, historical trade routes. So borders and border systems have their own life. We conceived this as a system that was essentially a function of a social system, the connectivity to a market system, and also something that greatly determined the state-society relationship. We were also looking at it as a system where we were looking at and measuring the health of flows of people and the health of flows of goods and ideas across the system, which is a natural speed of the system, but also undergoing a lot of variation because there was a lot of disruption along this border. And the disruption started as far back as about 2014. So we've had military operations. We have had one state, i.e. Pakistan, implementing a system, a border regime to securitize this region. So state capture, where state actors then become the most important beneficiaries in the system, i.e. they have a share in everything. And on the other hand, you had state collapse. And now we're beginning to see that as the Taliban de facto interim Taliban administration, let's call it, has consolidated control on the Afghan side, we're beginning to see a facilitated flow of militants into Pakistan, and a reversal of that paradigm where all of a sudden state capture on the Pakistani side is being challenged. So we may yet see a phenomena of state collapse on the Pakistani side. So none of these are static. Finally, within a border system, the key nodes of analysis for us are the border control points, right? The border crossings. And what we've noticed is that these are determined much more by local dynamics. So there is no border regime that can be implemented uniformly across an entire border system at the same time. They are functioning and responding and sliding through tiers of formality and informality based on local dynamics. So there are three patterns really of conflict that are very, very important to analyzing a system like this. The Afghanistan-Pakistan bilateral conflict, there is an irreconcilable difference between the state of Pakistan and the state of Afghanistan on the legitimacy of this border. So it is a contested border. It will always remain a contested border. You can have wildly different regimes in Afghanistan. They will still hold this position. It is a populist position and will not go away. Secondly, you have state-society relationship, which is really determined by how much the state regularizes it, how the health of the market system is affected, and how the restriction on flows is basically impacting negatively, in this case, people's livelihoods and ability to survive on both sides of the border. Finally, local conflict. And the health of the social system and key actors within the local system to arbitrate cross-border conflict. So these are the most important dynamics that we have seen. And in particular, when you are studying a system like this, structuring it along these lines has given us, many, many insights.
Thanks, Zima. I want to turn to just talking about the economic situation a little bit in Pakistan.
Right.
So Pakistan's economy has obviously been hit by domestic and global headwinds. Some quick figures: inflation was up 29% in 2023. The rupee has decreased by nearly half since 2021. Unemployment is at levels not seen for 2 decades, and there's a foreign currency liquidity crisis. What is the impact of this macroeconomic situation on conflict dynamics in the Pakistan border region?
Well, I think it impacts both the Pakistan and the Afghanistan border regions, because what you noticed with the collapse of the republic on the Afghan side was there was an immediate dependence of a large proportion of the Afghan borderland, but also a large proportion of the Afghan urban population on market systems on the Pakistani side. Those market systems had already been decimated by regulation, by military operations and their aftermath. So you had, first of all, a rupeeization of the border following the takeover of the Taliban. There was cashlessness in Afghanistan. Afghans were heavily dependent for cash on border markets. It changed over time into a system where foreign currency reserves from Pakistan by the money markets were being depleted and flowing into Afghanistan. So you've had for the borderland populations that are resident in the borderlands, you've had a system where we've layered fragility upon fragility. And don't forget, in the middle, you also had COVID. So in one of our surveys, we realized that about 84% of the borderland population within 1 week of lockdown was reduced to borrowing within the border system. The politics, and again, it's the political economy really that you have to tap into. The politics is there is no advocate, either in the system of the Republic or in the system under the Taliban. And certainly on the Pakistani side, you've had the military remaining the central actor in the system. Within this coalition of actors that find the ability to fight with each other or do business with each other, there is no advocate for the most marginalized within the system. So as far as policymakers are concerned, who are trying to look at the economic health of a region, the most important thing is to realize that the most vulnerable and the most marginalized are being systematically excluded from the system. And even the key brokers are now in reduced economic circumstances, so a little bit more desperate, but have never been real advocates for the most marginalized. And I think if you want a visual of it, it was those children who are hiding under trucks in order to cross into the border to sell a few key, household items to get the kind of cash that was needed for the week. So these are the people who have no advocates, no brokers, and no sort of patronage within the system, even when trade flows are excellent. And trade flows are resilient because, we've seen in the system, even the Taliban and militant actors such as the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan have been reluctant to attack trade.
Thanks. You're obviously describing a very challenging situation, and I'm really conscious of timing as well for this last question. But it is, I think, important to pivot to thinking about what can be done.
Yeah.
So maybe in a minute's time, what can we learn from what's been done in the past, and from your work and from other work? What would you suggest in starting to work to improve these situations in Pakistan?
I think two simple things, and I don't think they just apply to Pakistan, they apply everywhere. Number one, policymakers, foreign governments, international donor agencies have to have a very clear idea of what the relationship of their intervention with fragility is. Are you trying to treat fragility? Are you trying to manage fragility? Or are you just trying to leave well enough alone, avoid do no harm? Are you in that space? And the lower you go down, the more granular you get, becomes more and more important to have clarity on what you're trying to do. And secondly, I think it's incredibly important to pay attention to the health of the market system and how the interests of key actors within that market system are shaping itself. Those two.
Thank you so much, Nathan and Azima. I think we could have had the whole session just on Pakistan, but unfortunately, we need to move on. We're next going to have Mohammed and Ibrahim talking about issues in the Middle East, in particular Lebanon and Iraq. So over to the two of you.
Thank you, Paddy, and thank you, Nathan and Azima, and also to the World Bank for organizing this. I'm going to pick up from where Azima and Nathan stopped and look at a case study, which is more of an anomaly. And it's the kind of case studies that you come across when you're working on a project like Accept. Multiple years of research, and you come across different cases. And in this case, we were working on Akkar, which is in the north of Lebanon. It's a marginalized region. It's about 7% of the country's general area and also the population. Akkar has 100 kilometers long borders with Syria, and at the same time, multiple long history of smuggling across these borders. And being impoverished, Akkar has 63% of its population under the poverty line. It has the highest rates of poverty and food insecurity across the country. But at the same time, in addition to being impoverished, it's also a microcosm of the whole country in terms of its confessional setup. It has a large Sunni population, but also a very sizable Orthodox Christian and Maronite Christian populations, also a sizable Alawi minority. Dozens of thousands of Alawis live there. And given all of this reality and facts about Akkar and the long history of marginalization by the center, by Beirut, when the Syrian conflict started in 2011, 2012, after the crackdown on protests by the Assad regime, and as violence started to erupt and flows of refugees started coming into Akkar, the center was thinking about how Akkar will turn into this hotbed of violence. As it does, being impoverished, also having a large Sunni population and having a sizable Alawi minority. Across the borders, we've seen attacks which look like ethnic cleansing of certain Sunni areas, violence between Alawis and Sunnis. And so the thinking, conventional wisdom in Beirut was that Akkar will turn into another headache for the state in Lebanon. And in addition to that, as the Islamic State rose in Syria, and you had the Nusra, Al-Qaeda affiliated organization taking root on the Syrian side of the borders. Also in Beirut, there were so many scenarios woven. You can see them in the press, looking back at the archives in Lebanon, that ISIS will take over Akkar. You will see Al-Qaeda establishing an Islamic State in that region, and there will be ethnic cleansing and communal violence, etc. And you can see sources coming in from different levels of the Lebanese state discussing this. In reality, none of that happened. And Akkar, while centers like Tripoli and Beirut had heightened tensions between different communities, there were multiple cases of suicide bombers coming from Tripoli. There were suicide attacks in the southern suburbs of Beirut. In Akkar, there were, looking back at the archives, we only found 2 suicide bombers who came from Akkar, and actually they grew up and were raised out of all places in Sweden. So there were basically Swedish recruits who came to Lebanon, and then and in their town when they visited, they used to call them the foreigners. And there are multiple reasons for that. I mean, one, all of the communities in Akkar shared a long history of marginalization by the central state. So they had this common identity of being marginalized, whatever the sectarian belonging is. And at the same time, given the situation, their socio-economic realities, they joined the army at very high levels compared to the rest of the regions across the country. And the army is seen as a place where, one, a successful institution, but also an institution where the national identity project, the cross-sectarian identity project, is being pushed hard and seen as more of a melting pot on that level. In addition to all of that, there was basically a number of politicians that we were looking at from this area, like the leaders, the local leaders, or the local stakeholders, mostly they come from smuggling families. So they worked in smuggling. And as smugglers, they have networks, they have connections to everyone on the Lebanese side, on the Syrian side. So as the conflict took root, they saw opportunities in the conflict, and they tried to make money out of it. And in fact, they were so cynic in their approach to the polarization that came out of Beirut and Tripoli, to the extent that they've dealt with it in ways. For instance, I'll give you an example of an MP who was running in the past on a pro-Assad ticket in the elections. But then, as the anti-Assad sentiment rose, he made his son run on the anti-Assad ticket, and he was running on the pro-Assad ticket. That kind of cynicism towards the politics coming out of Beirut and Tripoli. And as the tide was turning in the Syria conflict, these politicians were pushing an agenda of let's see how we can, following the Russian intervention in 2015, a couple of years, we saw some narratives and rhetoric of let's make use of whatever reconstruction effort is coming out of the Syria conflict. The thinking was then that the conflict is going to end soon, there will be money flowing in for the reconstruction. And then, of course, Donald Trump happened and lots of sanctions coming in. And I think, all of that was out of the window. But during that period, there was significant policy debates. And these politicians in Akkar were pushing forward the idea of let's think about how we can make use out of it. But from Beirut, there was another narrative, which is basically that Russia has won in Syria. There's a new era in which the regional order has shifted. Russia will be a major player. So how about we establish a major trade hub, free trade hub, in an Orthodox town? Given that Russia is an Orthodox force, we can do that. So in that sense, the center was trying to accommodate whatever the regional order was throwing at it, and not thinking about the long-term security implications on the communal relations in Lebanon and on the country as a whole. And that also applies to the different regional pushed projects, regional-backed projects that we've seen also in Iraq, in another paper that's going to come out hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and looking at the development projects such as One Belt, One Road in Iraq, the major highway to Turkey, and also Iran's vision of how development should take place. So that multipolarity and that regional formative phase in which we're seeing middle powers rising and trying to create blueprints working for their own interests and their vision of how the region should look like given their own influences, is having an impact on how these states are approaching, these middle-income countries are approaching the issue of development. I don't want to take much of the time. I just want to switch to Ibrahim and ask him, given that he's coming from an anti-establishment background, he's an MP who was voted in as after the protest movement of 2019, he was voted in 2022, and you've spent 2 years in Parliament now, and I wanted to ask, in light of what we've discussed earlier, how do you assess the challenges of development from your point of view and from your experience in the last 2 years?
Well, thank you, Mohanad. Thank you for having me. Well, to answer your question, I think we need to go a little back in history to see how Lebanon really dealt with the lack of development in the first place. So, like you mentioned, somewhere in Akkar, it is a marginalized area, and we know that a lot of the peripheral area in Lebanon suffered from that. The issue with this, it was never addressed historically by the state in a way to address these inequalities or lack of development in Lebanon. Maybe there were in history just a little bit in the 60s where Fuad Shahab tried to create more or have a national plan to upgrade and to include development in these marginalized areas. However, there was no plan, basically, in Lebanon, a strategic plan to address these inequalities and lack of development. And unfortunately, and this is where the political class came and took advantage of this marginalization and tried to turn it into an identity issue. And this is what leads to the fragility, if we want to link all this to our fragility theme. So basically, you can see, for example, if you compare the South to Akkar, they had the same kind of inequality for a long time. They had the same marginalization. But it was led then by the deprived movement in the early or the late 70s, early 80s, which was turned into a Shiite issue rather than really addressing the lack of development specifically, not specifically, pardon me, to all the peripheral areas. So our political class here plays a very big role in maintaining these actually lack of development, because then it becomes beneficial to them to maintain this inequality as a reason for their being and to justify their presence and their identity politics, creating that sense of marginalization and capitalizing on it in politics and actually accentuating it and take it to the extreme. And this leads to a vicious cycle of creating more and more of fostering that kind of inequality and channeling only development through these political groups as a means of a kind of nepotism and clientelistic network to maintain or justify their presence as political representative. So this, over time, has led to a lot of challenging in creating a national policy for development for Lebanon as a whole, specifically for these marginalized areas, like you mentioned in Akkar. And now in Lebanon, we suffer more and more of external factors that have came into the equation in the past 4 or 5 years, even starting 2011 by the Syrian refugees crisis, that a lot of influx of refugees came to Lebanon, and now it's creating more and more of pressure on these already marginalized areas and creating more and more polarization, social polarization within the Lebanese community, and multiple of compounded problems resulting from the financial crisis, where we're not able to take a lead in how we can fund or find solutions to our collapsing economy. We have also the immigration issue that is really becoming a huge demographic problem, because we have a lot of Lebanese fleeing the country year by year. And of course, the war in the south, which is creating a very fragile and unstable environment for any development strategy. So if we put all this together, we see that we have such a fragile situation that does not allow for any proper intervention by the state to create now any intervention at the level of development for these marginalized areas. So we are very much challenged by how the political class is managing all the situation and not providing any insight or vision to take us from this problematic area. You know?
Just a follow-up question on that, because we had a discussion earlier about the general political debates and how focused they are on the regional outcomes and whatever deal comes out between the United States and Iran, between the multiple regional players that we've seen across the past years. And I just wanted to ask you whether you think the political class can do more to push back against these regional shifts and the attempts to basically to dictate the political thinking and the political agenda and the public agenda in Lebanon.
Well, as you know, Muhannad, like the political class, they have their all different affiliations to the different regions. So each group of this political class has its own reference. We have, although these represent kind of confessional groups, these confessional groups is very much tied to other regional powers, and these regional powers have their own interests in Lebanon, and they have their own agendas. And this will be very much linked to the kind of development that will be funded basically through these groups. So you will see that many of these political groups, they will push back on any agenda that is coming from the opponent or from a different area, despite that it might be beneficial to other Lebanese communities. So you can see how much this can create a lot of friction and a lot of conflict within the government, within the state, and knowing the fact that most of our governments are unity governments, like most of the political factions are represented within the governments, you can see how this will reflect on our capacity to create a coherent or a unified development strategy for all of Lebanon. And this is where we all have been always stuck. We're not able to unite over a development agenda that would really cater for all Lebanese equally. So you can see how, for example, the Saudi agenda, the Iranian agenda, Turkish agenda, and so on, you will have a lot of those manifesting in discussions and conflicting within the government and within the representation of these confessional political parties.
Thank you very much. I'll take it back to Paddy, given the time.
No, thank you so much, and also for your discipline with time. We have so much to cover. So we're delighted to have Assistant Secretary Witkowski here, representing the US government, and I think we'd like to move a little bit towards responses about what we can do about many of these problems. So I understand your strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, and the corresponding 10-year plans submitted to Congress last year drew heavily on local research and consultations. So what were the results of these intensive local engagement, and what does this reveal about fragility risks and major drivers of instability in your priority middle-income countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patty, and thank you to the speakers, my colleagues who have elaborated on a number of issues that resonate very much with the kind of what we've unpacked. So let me start with a few words about the strategy itself, which derives from the Bipartisan Global Fragility Act of 2019. And the strategy sets forth a long-term approach that elevates prevention to address evolving vulnerabilities facing certain countries, which include a number of middle-income countries. And so we talked a little bit about how governments are approaching some of these issues that have been raised already, and I just wanted to say a few words about what we're doing. We have essentially a reform effort underway in which the U.S. government does business in areas at risk or experiencing instability. So there are 5 points I just want to make on this, and then we'll come to your specific question. So first of all, we're placing renewed emphasis on the context-specific drivers of fragility, one. And with that, elevating the voices or the perspectives of local partners. Second, as part of the internal work that we're doing, we're ensuring whole-of-government efforts, which include diplomatic engagement, foreign assistance, security sector support. We're engaged with our Treasury Department. We're seeking to bring the tools of the U.S. government to bear on the agenda that we've identified, the plans through our work in the strategy. We're working to deepen our partnerships with bilateral partners and also multilateral organizations as we work together seeking to work together more closely to address some of the challenges we've identified. We've emphasized adaptive learning and evidence-based decision-making so that the plans, which have just been articulated here as having a 10-year time horizon, will be adapted and iterated over time. And last, we're using what we call a cross-sectoral approach to address the interconnected challenges that may bear on conflicts. So one example with that would be women's participation in critical activities to advance local ownership and ensure richer context-driven understanding of conflict drivers, effects, and responses. So we've developed these 10-year plans, as has been identified, in 4 priority countries and 1 priority region. And the middle-income countries that are included in this grouping are Libya, and then Ghana, Benin, and Cote d'Ivoire, which are part of a larger regional approach that we're taking that also includes Togo and Guinea, that coastal West Africa region. So as we approached our work in the plans, we intentionally took a very consultative approach to determining how to move forward. So that included not only national governments, but also local stakeholders, civil society, including women and youth, think tanks, and the private sector. And as a result of these consultations, we've shaped the focus of our efforts in our 10-year plans. And not only that, but we have sought wherever we can to align the national plans, align U.S. support behind the national plans of our partner countries and incentivize national and local government actors themselves to tackle challenges. So, to your question, we surfaced a number of points, but let me just mention a couple. One is that the consultations made clear that extremist ideologies can take root and fester in communities that have been under or ill-served by governance, as has already been discussed, and by security institutions. What is the approach of the security and the justice institutions? And reinforce the evidence that marginalization is a key driver of instability, even in these middle-income countries. So in the northern regions of Benin and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, for example, there's a common risk factor of persistent poverty. And these areas are more vulnerable to environmental, social, political, and security stresses, which can lead to other issues like economic disruption, humanitarian crises, and so forth. So even as governments themselves, with whom we are partnering, are seeking to address economic and political marginalization, we know that violent extremist organizations and criminal networks can exploit gaps to gain access and to exert influence in these areas. So that's one type of finding. And then another, if I may, I know we're short on time, is something that really hasn't come up here yet, and that is the question of climate stress and what impact that might have, what kind of a driver it may have on particular areas and regions. So our evidence shows that climate-driven shifts, inconsistent rainfall patterns, temperature spikes, can increase the likelihood or prolong episodes of drought, for example. That puts pressure on already scarce resources, a dynamic that threatens livelihoods and increases economic uncertainty, and in particular, where there may be different groups that need access to those resources. In the case of these northern regions, both herders and farmers, that can exacerbate tension or even lead to certain conflict. And so I think this is an area as well that we need to, in which we need to do more work.
Thank you. I have two more questions for you. I'll roll them into one, just in the interest of time. So you already mentioned that coastal West Africa is one of your target areas, and that we have Benin, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire are middle income amongst the 5 countries that you're working on there. Could you say a little bit about how you're addressing these risks in coastal West Africa? And then you're also focusing on Libya, which is a very different type of context. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the US government strategy is different there.
Let me do my best in the short amount of time that we have available to us. So, first of all, broadly speaking, in the coastal West Africa region, which includes Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Benin as our middle-income countries that have been identified, is to strengthen our own engagement and work more effectively with governments there to mitigate risks in at-risk areas as a significant focus. So, we're working to strengthen social cohesion, supporting governments in strengthening social cohesion, improve government responsiveness, and as well as security reinforce responsiveness and accountability, and overall build a shared vision of prevention. I just want to take a moment to note that our Secretary Blinken, our Secretary of State, was recently in Cote d'Ivoire, as was our Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and took note of one of the ways in which we are approaching with the government of Cote d'Ivoire this particular set of issues, and that is very inclusive and very integrative, both. So just to draw from something that they've said, our Undersecretary said, we especially appreciate the inclusive approach that Cote d'Ivoire is taking, working and engaging with communities, respecting human rights, and promoting economic opportunity for all. Increasing fair and transparent justice for all citizens is a critical part of that inclusive approach. And our Secretary, when he was there a few weeks ago, also noted the approach that Cote d'Ivoire has been taking, applauding it, working with communities, listening to communities, making sure that their security forces understand the needs, the concerns of local communities, and building security together. This integrative approach is very central to what we're about. Then there are two others I'd like to highlight. We're taking a regional approach, as I've said. We're looking at the region as a whole. Violent extremist organizations do not respect borders, and given the common threat along countries' northern borders, the regional approach is really critical to strengthening resilience and enhancing the responsiveness and accountability of security there. And then secondly, we are very focused on improving the way that we collaborate and coordinate with other donors and other actors who are also engaged in this particular on this particular set of issues. It's important to work together, and we understand that different stakeholders bring different strategic advantages to the table. So our success will depend on our ability to develop strategic collaboration with our partners and leverage our strengths to achieve mutual priorities. And we are already engaged in a couple of new mechanisms that have been developed pursuant to the strategy. One that's focused on border security, and that is multi-donor, and then another one that is a multi-donor initiative that targets countries, also northern border areas, focusing on socioeconomics, support, infrastructure, and building trust among communities, providing for community-driven, also non-lethal security sector support. Two new mechanisms already pursuant to the work that we're doing. And then finally, I just want to say one more thing, which is about private sector engagement. And that's something that we talked about a little bit here, but we think is important to expand the work of the private sector while addressing these challenges. And I think there are going to be some other panels here at the Fragility Forum that are going to look at this, increasing incentives for private sector investment that are quote unquote off the radar. And I'm glad to see that we'll be doing this. And we ourselves are interested in expertise and evidence on peace-enhancing investment and sustaining livelihoods in those particular places. Now, you also bundled a question together, Patty, on Libya. Do I have time to answer that?
No, please do.
Okay,
Please
let
do.
me talk a little bit about Libya, because that is a very different environment, though you'll hear some similar themes. So there, what we're doing was taking a flexible and adaptive approach focused on, again, community level programs that can be scaled up as opportunities rise. And the initial focus of our work in Libya is in southern Libya, where we're collaborating with UN agencies and like-minded partners like the EU and European diplomatic missions to set the conditions for positive change in the South. And that's both another note about donor coordination, which is extremely vital. But the approach there focuses on southern Libya, I think, for a couple of reasons which are worth mentioning. First, it's a region that's been historically neglected and marginalized, and we think that incorporating local stakeholders can reinforce national level reconciliation, a fundamental goal of the United States policy in Libya. And second, that instability and security vacuums in southern Libya have had ripple effects throughout the Sahel and can provide an enabling environment for malign actors. So the benefits of working to improve stability in southern Libya could extend not only across the country, but to other regions as well.
Thank you so much. That was very informative, and it's great to hear about the US government looking to collaborate as well. For example, the World Bank, we have a regional project on social cohesion in the Gulf of Guinea working on these very same countries, and I think it would be good to discuss further how we can collaborate on that. Apologies, but I'm going to keep you slightly longer from your lunch because I think we'd like to offer at least a brief opportunity for questions. So if we can take 2 questions from online, 2 questions in the room, and then we'll take all 4, and then I'll ask each of the panelists to respond to those where they feel they may have something to offer. Juliette?
We have one question online. I can't remember who it was directed to, but it says, a point was made that intervention of international actors need to have more granular understanding. While this is an excellent point, how do you suggest that international actors could develop this granular understanding as essentially outsiders in a particular situation?
Thank you, Juliette. And do we have 2 from the room? Please come up to the microphone, and if you could introduce yourself as well.
Hello, my name is Mayada Shaukat. Thank you for having us here in person finally. I worked on stabilization projects with the DoD in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the problem with the conflict, it affects the neighboring countries, and if it's middle income countries, then it destroys the infrastructure, and then we have the refugee crisis, the income burden and economy burden on the countries. We focus on the ongoing conflict. We're going to have a very new refugee crisis, and the neighboring countries, again, it's Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, that they already have camps that is still from 75 years ago that is still ongoing.
Can we get to the question?
Are we as like the U.S. government would focus on the refugee camps? That can we integrate them to communities, because that's PVE, like violence prevention, and CVE definitely affects the kids when they are older. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have one more? If you could come up to the mic.
Hi, Alison Miner from the Brookings Institution. I was interested in the example of Lebanon, where you acknowledged that the state's ability to support development interventions, especially in these border regions, is obviously limited given what they're going through. But at the same time, Assistant Secretary Wojciechowski, that collaboration with local governments is essential to at least the U.S. strategy, but most other development actor strategies. And given the diversity of all of the challenges across border regions, not to mention along different borders, you really do need that local perspective. So in those instances where you don't have a strong national partner, what do you suggest in terms of those locally driven and nationally led interventions for actors like the United States and the World Bank? Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Okay, we'll go from this end to that end. If each of the panelists could give any responses they feel they have something to add on, or any closing reflections, but again, let's keep it fairly brief, otherwise we may have a mutiny as people get more and more hungry. Ibrahim.
Well, I understand then how difficult it would be to collaborate with states who are not able to take their own matters on. And unfortunately, we see this in Lebanon, that there is really no solution but a really strong state. Today, we have so many initiatives, and after the distrust of the political class by the international community and international institutions, they are trying another alternative of channeling funding for development through NGOs that have created so much chaos. in Lebanon, especially that when the political class who are ruling and they are who are in control of the ministries are having a negative reaction towards rechanneling the funding outside their ministries. So they are not collaborating and they are not helping out in coordinating these efforts and this funding as a reaction to not channeling those funds through them. So I really don't have an answer of how you can do that if you don't have a proper state, strong state who can take over and provide us a strategy that is that addresses the needs of these marginalized areas as much as we know from a local perspective. But I think the only way, maybe, I'm not sure it can be held from outside, for us as Lebanese in particular, is to empower new political alternative powers who would be able to address these needs and provide these strategies and be credible to both their Lebanese people and the international community to take on this burden of developing these marginalized communities.
Well, let me see. Just maybe a more generic response to Allison, to your question, which would be that as we go forward, as I've already said, we're looking at not only partnering with national governments but also with local actors, and the strength of those networks varies. But in many cases, we do have strong networks. The United States does, that have been developed over time, or we're working through other actors who have those seeking to partner with those who do. And I think this is the way we need to move forward. Ultimately, of course, in places where there are not strong national governments or governments elected through fair and free elections, we are simultaneously working to move in that direction as well, is an essential feature of our policy. In terms of the question around the integration of local communities, again, I think this is very dependent, situation dependent, and something that we need to, whoever asked that question, incorporate into our policy, understanding the needs of local actors and where there are opportunities available over time. Ultimately, what we're looking at is a structure where local communities have some measure of access to government services, of opportunities for peace building, for economic development, economic opportunity, for and a measure of a modicum of accountable and responsive security, and I think that is a feature that carries through in a lot of the work that we're doing, and will continue to move forward. I'll just say one more thing before we close, and that is to the point about prevention or any of the work that we're doing here, and that is something that we need to be mindful of. Specifically, I know this audience is very experienced, but I think it's worth to remember that the work that we're doing is really hard, and it takes place over a long period of time. I know the length of your research, and I think that we have to measure our progress not in days and weeks, but in years and generations. And I hope that that is not something that I've said. That is something that President Biden has said, and it's something that we consider a watchword for our work under the U.S. strategy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would reiterate basically what Brahim has mentioned, which is that the state has to have a coherent long-term development strategy and reconcile that with whatever the shifting geopolitical order is throwing at us. Whether in terms of development projects or aid coming in. I think it's a clear case that the current geopolitical order, which is emerging and still informative period, is highly susceptible to conflict on the local level, and using And using that, I think, looking at that, the states, the central states, have to put in place a coherent strategy for development and try to reconcile that with whatever comes from the aid side of things.
Yeah, I will just answer the question about the local research and how do you, as a government external to the system, develop that. I think recognize that conventional wisdom on conflict theory no longer holds anymore. Conflict theory is a very it's a nascent, evolving, mostly written by the experiences of World War II field that is being challenged, and so develop thematic expertise in-house and use the thematic expertise and toolkits in-house within your institutions to stress test the information that you get from the field and be open to what you get. Recognize that when you fund something, you are also creating, feeding into the political economy of the information that you are getting. For instance, when we were looking at Afghanistan before the takeover of the Taliban, they were telling us very openly that political settlements had been done and that these cities would be handed over peacefully. There was no government audience for that information at that time. So, and there was a lot of information that was saying very different stuff that there was an audience for. So I'd say be skeptical of the information that you get and put the researchers to the test. And have that level of evaluation built into your systems. Because even we have to then be accountable at the end of the day. We also work on taxpayer money, right? But recognize that, again, conventional wisdom does not hold anymore. Whether you are looking at elections, whether you are, I would also question this assumption on the link between climate and conflict. It has yet to be empirically established for most places. Coherent threads here don't yet exist. And it was the same with poverty and extremism back in the day, before many people debunked it. So yeah, that's basically what I would advise.
Okay, very quickly, so we can all go have lunch. I think the point about granular understandings, local perspectives, integrating that into policy making and thinking around these topics, I think there are already some frameworks that are coming through that need to be, need to be backed with more support and to be made stronger. The grand bargain, the push for the localization of humanitarian aid in particular, but then also that feeds into the fields of development and peace building, which we're here to talk about. There needs to be a greater efforts to make those partnerships and to make those discussions about what conflict is, what fragility is, need to be done at a more horizontal level between local communities affected by those conflicts, the international actors that somewhat play an interlocutor mode at the moment, and the donors in the international community which are looking to address this. And the way we do that through the Accept project is, we really empower the partners that we work with, like Azima, like many others who can't be here today, is to co-design, co-develop, and lead the work that they're doing. Tell us what is going on in the situation. Tell us what is wrong, and we'll work with you to produce that research and that analysis, and to be able to promote that in forums like this. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But just quickly on the point about refugees. And I'm thinking to some work that we've been doing in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar with Rohingya groups. And there's an opportunity to recognize the agency and the desires and wills of these groups that are experiencing conflict and have been affected by it. And to incorporate that into the development and other programming opportunities that you're taking place, that you're undertaking in those regions. Asking questions, what do you want to see? What do you want to tell policymakers about your situation? What changes do you want to see in your camp? How do you want to contribute to a more, to greater livelihoods, greater stability in your area? And there's plenty of ideas that are coming out of that. Making sure that the work that we're doing is not just extractive, but has feedback loops to be able to promote the analysis back into the communities that you're working in, and really looking at having more horizontal relationships in the way in which we do aid and development.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you to all the panelists for what I thought was a really great discussion today. Thank you also to all those who joined online, as well as all of you who stayed in the room as well. This is a discussion to be continued. Please do keep track of the research that Carnegie and the Asia Foundation are doing. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Fragility Forum. It's great for us all to be back in the room together and enjoy the rest of the panels and the rest of the forum. Thank you.